There we go. Further ado, we'll start the meeting. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever you herald from. I'm Paul Clements-Hunt from the Blended Capital Group, and this is the final and concluding session in an 8-month online series that we kicked off with the United Nations in South Africa last June, which has been anchored by Professor Paul Watchman, who's with us, and also Judge Professor Mervyn King from South Africa. And in short, just to give you context, what we've looked to do over the last 8 months is, first of all, understand how business in different parts of the world, business and investment, including the legal community and professional service players, reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we've cycled through the great uncertainty and the remaining uncertainty of the last 8 months, the conversation is now turning to what recommendations can business and investment make in the context of how we were to perhaps handle future pandemics, but also how we to build out successfully, with a particular focus on some of the poorest people in the world and the poorest communities and the entrepreneurs in developing countries and frontier economies, as well as the pockets of poverty in the developed world, the G7, the G20, the OECD countries. So it's crossing the bounds. What I would say with today as the concluding session is that on Thursday, we will present 2 sessions to the United Nations World Investment Forum, who've asked us to present recommendations. They will be captured under the banner of the Waterberg Declaration. So that's a declaration which will stay open from January the 28th until the end of the year, looking for businesses and investors to sign up and align themselves with the sentiments of the declaration, which essentially provides recommendations for how business can help society, community, and themselves build out of what has been a dreadful and tragic pandemic. So hopefully that gives everybody the context. This is the second of our 2-hour conversations this morning. We touch on Brazil, we touch on Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, and Australia. So we've got quite a time zone spread. And with that, I'm going to ask Professor Watchman to make opening comments, and maybe with some reflections of what he heard this morning also. But Paul, if I can turn the microphone over to you, and the floor is yours. And if you can come on video, that would be great. But if not, not a problem. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you for your opening comments.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I thought I might start by, having stolen Mervyn King's spot, I thought I might start by asking you to imagine that you're Tom Hanks. You're playing an investment banker whose yacht gets into difficulty somewhere in the South Seas, and you've been marooned for the last 21 years on a desert island. You are flown back into the UK, and they insist that you quarantine, you go into isolation. So you're catching up with what's happened in the investment world in the last 21 years. You hear people talking about integration, and that doesn't strike you as very sensible, because the code of the investment banker is the devil takes the hindmost. So this idea of integrating skills and sharing things together, and people talking about global issues rather than issues relating to Wall Street or the City of London, has you a bit perplexed. You also hear people talking about climate change, and you think that the science of climate change has still not been proven, and people think it's all a hoax that's been made up to discredit the fossil fuel companies. ESG, people keep saying ESG, and you wonder what that is. Is it some sort of football team that you just haven't picked up, like Paris Saint-Germain, and they've just got the P and E mixed up? You hear people talking about sustainability in finance, but finance has never been sustainable. The business of business is business, and as far as you're concerned, Milton Friedman still rules the roost. Business is bracketed with human rights, and your lawyers start to talk about complicity and child labour and chocolate, and what's all that got to do with anything? And worst of all, they're talking about something called corona economics. Now, what is that? Where did that come from? And the answer to these and other questions have you a bit perplexed. So being this banker, investment banker, who unfortunately has got a very limited imagination, as they tend to have, he asks for some guidance. So he phones me up as his lawyer and says, Paul, tell me what's happened. I said, well, we've moved to a stakeholder model. He said, you mean the great unwashed? We have to think about what to do with the great unwashed. And we have to think about the great unwashed, not only in the context of London, but even further afield, like Bradford or Edinburgh, or Bolton. This just cannot be right. So I try and break it to him very gently that the world's changed. And I said, it's a bit like climate change and the pandemic. You cannot shelter yourself. And one of the points that was made this morning, which I thought was an excellent point, was that the resilience of a bank or the resilience of your company is to do with your shareholders, your stakeholders, and your clientele and customers. That you're only as resilient as the people you do business with and the values of those people. So I said, give me some, he says, give me some examples, Paul, of what's been happening recently. I said, well, there's been a lot of ESG funds being made up. He said, no, PSG funds. You're talking about PSG funds, not ESG, but I'll let that one go. I said, yeah, well, people have been investing their money in funds that do the right thing. And those have been very successful. He said, no, they can't be successful because all you're doing is playing politics with other people's money. Climate change, I said, people now accept climate change as a reality and that we have to take steps to bring carbon emissions down to zero. Yes, he said, well, I'm not quite convinced that that's right. But I said, well, BP have recently announced they're no longer going to be a fossil fuel company and to move out of that. Hi, Mervyn, I'm halfway through your talk. Will I continue, Paul, and then we'll hand over to Mervyn now?
Yeah, for sure, Paul, and and then we'll switch over to Mervyn. Welcome, Professor King. Thank you for joining us again after this morning session. I'll come to you briefly for opening comments after Paul has finished. I love the idea of an investment banker lost in time, Paul. So back to you, Paul. Please continue, and then we'll go to Professor King.
So it's a bit like that episode of The Simpsons, what Back to the Future, where Liza turns up as President of the United States in a purple outfit with pearls, and we find the Vice President of the United States this year wearing exactly the same outfit, and the author of that episode of The Simpsons saying that when they made Donald Trump President of the United States, they were trying to be as fanciful as possible. And he said, Donald Trump's the President of the United States. I said, yes, no one's told you that. He was until you came back a day or two ago. So the other thing I said to him, look, I'll break it to you gently. Law firms are doing a lot in this ESG space. They might not be doing it as well as they can, but they've started to integrate their practice and see ESG as important, both in legal terms, but also in terms of their own culture. It's very difficult to preach gender equality when you're running a firm that's based on gender inequality. And there's a lot of issues like that law firms are starting to take up. How can you be a Democrat, be a lawyer, be anti-Trump and represent Nestle and Cargill in respect of the child labour and exploitation of cocoa plantation farmers? And he said, well, that's what you lawyers do. I once heard Woody Allen say, I'm a lawyer, I've got scruples, but if you don't like those scruples, I have others. And it's that sort of issue that's come to the fore. I said, well, you also have to know about litigation. Litigation, they've been starting to take action in respect of who's responsible for climate change and against governments, against pension funds, and against the oil and gas majors. So this is a terrible, terrible news, Paul. I think I preferred it in my desert island. I said, well, on your desert island, you might be interested on supply chain issues. And he said, supply chain? I said, yes, supply chain. You have to trace back what you who you deal with and what you deal with, so that you can have provenance and prove that they come from a sustainable source. And I don't like any of this, he said. And I said, finally, employees have got rights. He said, yes, male employees have rights, don't they? I said, women too. He said, but women have got rights? I said, yeah, gay people and colored people also have rights. He said, oh, this is terrible. He finishes by saying, I want to go back to my desert island. I don't feel comfortable in this new world. And I think one of the things that we have arrived at is it is an uncomfortable world just now with climate change, with the pandemic, with changes and shifts in values and different views. And Professor King said this morning that he'd written that accountants can save the world. Well, I think there's many accountants, bankers and lawyers who owe it to the world to make efforts, if not to save it, to protect it from further damage. So these are the issues that I would like to talk about with you this afternoon. And in saying that, I'll now hand over to Mervyn King so that he can do his part of the talk.
Paul, let me come in for a second and then I'll bridge to Professor King to make his opening comments. I just want to say thank you for the colourful reboot from the conversation this morning. And the idea that, you know, a lost investment banker is dropped back into the world. And you're only talking about an investment banker from 2000. That's 21 years ago.
Yeah.
So in some ways, one of the let me post this not as a question, but as a thought, which is one of the things which is run through our conversations is that we're clearly at an inflection point in terms of an understanding or an appreciation of systemic risk, of the fault lines of our society. And you paint that picture very beautifully. The question that begs is that inflection point something which will just evaporate as the world goes back to normal and the economic engines start and people get back into the serious business of making money? Or is it an inflection point where it is fundamental? And in the early years of this century, we've been sent a profound, I guess, signal around systemic risk, the management of it. COVID is a novel zoonotic virus, which we're hearing are going to come more frequently because of the incursion of the 7.8 billion rising to 10 billion people by the end of the century into unusual areas. So, Paul, thank you, Professor Watchman, who, I mean, your work over the years has been, I guess, fundamental and foundational. The Freshfields report of 2005 really created ESG. And, you know, 15 years on, we have this movement which is mainstreamed and is moving. So, Paul, thank you for your opening comments and the colourful reboot. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Judge Professor Mervyn King, who again has been with us since the start of this process. This is Mervyn's second parachute in today. So, Mervyn, we really appreciate your commitment and time. But I'd like you to follow on from Paul and, you know, as the architect of coronanomics, please give us your opening comments, and then that will kickstart a good conversation. Thank you, Mervyn.
Well, thank you, and excuse my not joining timelessly, but I just had difficulty connecting. I spoke this morning about the fact that companies are swimming today in a sea of two crises, and that is economic and viral. And therefore, some months ago, I coined the word coronanomics to combine the two, because directors have to be mindful that these are two crises in which they're steering their companies. And so we are talking about what's going to happen post-COVID. So we're talking about when we get to a herd immunity, which my understanding from the medical world is that's going to take the vaccination, will get us to herd immunity vaccinations, which can take 18 months, 2 years to complete around the world. So we are in a survival, we being companies are in the survival mode, and I'm talking about limited liability companies, which is the main engine for business today and the chosen medium through which business is conducted. So directors have to think short term, but have to think on an integrated basis. The days of thinking in silos, such as the primacy of the shareholder, have come to an end. And everybody thinks on an integrated basis. What are the resources used by a company in producing its product or rendering its service? What are the relationships with its stakeholders? And there's got to be a symphony of the connection between the relationships with stakeholders and the resources used. And resources are constrained. During the 20th century, we had a century of unsustainable development because of the Friedman Doctrine and the whole history of the development of companies during the 20th century. And we realized through expedited research from the computer age of the 70s that when we turned into the 21st century, the non-financial assets of the world actually in makeup of the market capitalization of companies listed on the great stock exchanges of the world, London, New York, etc., made up 80% of the market cap of companies. Only 20% was exhibited as additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. This led to the founding of the Global Reporting Initiative in '97, when some guidance was needed for reporting on this 80% of value. The latest analysis, by the way, which was only about a few months ago, shows this is now 10% only of the market cap of iconic companies, for example, listed on the S&P 500, is reflected as additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. This has led to great movement in the ESG space over the last 9 months, galvanized, I am told, by a speech I gave in London in March 2019, when I termed it a social outrage, and I happened to have the executives of the GRI, SASB, CDSB, FASB, IFRS, the whole alphabet soup was in the room. And I said it's a social outrage that framework providers and people working in this space regard themselves as competitors when they're dealing with public interest issues. And they're doing it for the same public good outcome, namely to make reporting more informed, so that the trustees of pension funds, for example, could make a more informed decision whether to leave their beneficiaries' money continue to be invested in the equity of that company or not. But I'm told that that speech and the corporate reporting dialogue, which I helped to form as chairman of the IRC, the corporate reporting dialogue brought all these people in the ESG space together, and we tried to get them to harmonize the guidance and standards because comparability was being diluted. And not very successful, but I am told that my talk saying it was a social outrage galvanized people into talking. And in the last 4 months, we've had extraordinary movement in the ESG space. We've had the 5 main players in the framework providing space, SASB, GRI, CDSB, CDP, and the IIRC, declaring a statement of intent to try and harmonize standards on ESG so we could get back to a more informed comparability. The IOSCO has agreed that ESG is essential for sustainable finance. IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, has issued a consultation paper in which they've called for comment as to whether they should or should not expand their constitution to include non-financial as well as financial matters. Should they, in the oversight body which they are over the IASB, International Accounting Standards Board, have an International Sustainability Standards Board with one standard? And I'm told that the consultation period came to an end on the 31st of December, but overwhelmingly, there is positive support for the IFRS monitoring board overseeing the IFRS Board of Trustees, they overseeing the IASB, forming an ISSB alongside the IASB, and then connecting the material matter out of the financial and the non-financial through integrated reporting. So integrated thinking will be at the center of what we have now called the Value Reporting Foundation through the merger of SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the International Integrated Reporting Council. So much movement in that space. So when we move, economies move back into survival mode, we cannot, as directors, just sit and act short-term and think on an integrated basis, which we're doing collaboratively, SDG 17, and compromising because of the hardship suffered by stakeholders. And the stakeholders have to realize the hardship suffered by companies to compromise. So short-term and integrated collaborative compromising mindset, but we cannot leave the elephant in the room, which is climate change, also cybersecurity. We've got a plan for it long-term in our business model. So when we move into thriving mode from survival mode in 2 years' time, let's say, the world's economies, and the global economy turns into a thriving mode, our companies have to be ready. Otherwise, I believe directors are failing in their duty of care to a company. And I go further to say a board that the collective mind of a board that doesn't consider the impact of climate change on that company is failing in its duty of care. Let me conclude by saying sustainability as a coin has got two sides. There is the GRI vision of looking at it through civil society lens. What are the impacts of how a company makes its money or its product on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, meaning sustainable development for those who come after us, and the enterprise value creation lens, which is the SASB approach. What are the impacts of the three critical dimensions, the economy, society, and the environment on the company? Its financial condition, its balance sheet, its operating performance, its income statement and cash flow, its risk profile, its market capitalization, and its cost of capital. We have to be ready for all these things. And so I speculate, I believe the IFRS will agree to oversee, and the people in the framework providers in the ESG space, as I'm talking to you, they're talking about harmonizing, including talking to the TCFD. So a lot of alphabet soup, but I think that those online here understand what I'm talking about. And I believe we will find there's going to be a sustainability standards board formed over the next couple of years, and we will have one standard of sustainability reporting, certainly in the 144 countries over which the IFRS at the moment have jurisdiction with their standards of financial reporting. Thank you, Paul.
Professor King, again, I mean, tour de force from both yourself and Professor Watchman. Let me add a couple of my own thoughts, reflections, if I may. And I mean, Professor King, I'll come to you first. I'm sure, and I know you recall, that when you, with Sir Michael Peat, convened the Integrated Reporting Council back at the first decade of the century, that you had to. We went to. I was honoured to be on it as a UN official. We had to go to HSBC's boardroom in Canary Wharf simply because it was the biggest boardroom round table that could seat 43 people. And I think that for me is always a metaphor of the complexity, where you're bringing different standard bodies, different jurisdictions, different geographies, different cultures together, and you need a round table of 43 people. I mean, it's a simple observation. It's a very fond memory. I remember the morning we met, we were high above the clouds in Canary Wharf. It seemed as though we were on a spaceship. So again, it's complexity. And people say, oh, it's taken a long time for ESG and all these different standards to come about. To be honest, I think what is happening with the standards and with ESG, and that provision of a lens so we can look at systemic risk, whether it's COVID or climate or cybersecurity, it hasn't taken that long. And I salute your incredible work over the decades. I'll just reference back to Professor Watchman, who, again, another memory. And I think I was always the troublemaker in the process. But when we went to Paul at Freshfields Brookhouse Derringer in 2004-05, and we said, we're from the UN, we've got this thing which is evolving called ESG. It was GES, but we decided to put the S in the middle to protect it from being flicked off the end. So it's environment, social, governance. Could you have a look at this? And Paul grabbed it with two hands. Freshfields then produced a legal interpretation, which was 150 pages, looking at ESG and fiduciary law in the 9 major capital market jurisdictions. I mean, I'm just picking from two, incredible pieces of work. where people have such great experience and foresight. And those things have converged. And I think they're what have driven, in part, what you've just described, Mervyn, as the reality we have now. But we cannot be complacent. I'm going to conclude the opening comments. And again, I want to thank Professor Watchman and Professor King. This is the last time we're doing this in this format. This is the concluding session after 8 months. And just maybe one last reflection, if I may. Paul, the first morning we met, I think was July the 7th, 2005. And we discussed ESG and fiduciary law. And as I walked out of the Freshfields building on Fleet Street, it was that dreadful morning of the London bombings, I think, if you recall. And as I stepped out onto the street, we didn't know anything had happened, but you could feel that the air had changed. Something had happened. We didn't know what it was, but we knew something had happened. And that was a phenomenal memory. What's the point there? I feel that in some ways the air has changed around ESG, around reporting, around what Mervyn has just described. But there is not a moment for complacency, because we all know, Paul, that the investment banker from the desert island you described, and this is not to be pejorative of investment bankers, but the idea that you think short term, you make money, and the business of business is business, I think has to be finally put where it belongs, because it can easily come back. The business of business is people, planet, and the rest. And that's why this conversation is so rich. So again, gentlemen, thank you for your work over many decades, and also for your commentary to open this up. Without any further ado, I'm going to go to our first panel. And I hope you don't mind me bringing those memories to the table, Mervyn and Paul, but they're very clear in my head still. We're going to go to our first panel. The format is we have speakers from different parts of the world. This morning we had Japan and Australia and Thailand and India and the UK. Today, this afternoon, we have South Africa, we have Brazil, we have Nigeria, we have the UK, South Africa again. So a real rainbow of nations. The structure is brief interventions from speakers, and then we go to a respondent and we try to tease things out. So I'm delighted to welcome Martin Rich, who's the co-founder of the Future Fit Foundation, to perhaps reflect on what you've heard and tell us about your vision of sustainability and how you wish to change the systems, to change the world, to change the companies. Martin, the floor is yours, and thank you again to the two professors.
Thank you, Paul. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to everybody who's listening in. It's a shame we can't see all of the faces on the screen, but the world is indeed changed when an investment banker or ex-investment banker finds himself being barracked by a lawyer for 5 minutes of all people at the start of this. But thank you, Paul. And indeed, I know that boardroom in HSBC, having formerly worked there as well, Paul. So the view is fantastic across the city from there. But I want to pick up actually on Professor Watchman's comment on inflection points as a start for my comments, because I think we really have hit that point. And I know a lot of people are talking about what happens from here as we start to recover. And I love the comments from Professor King about how we're going to move through the stage of recovery and then hopefully back into flourishing. And I hope 2 years is indeed the maximum number. One hopes that it will be less, one fears it probably will be at least that. But I think what we are recognizing through the pandemic is that business is simply nothing like as resilient as we all thought it was. And I think that has opened many to realize that we have to reappraise what we even mean by success in business. The duty of care that was mentioned. What does that really mean? When we look at the virus itself and these concepts of these novel zoonotic diseases that we're now all learning about, that were brought into existence because of the very environmental and social degradation that we've seen happening. Now, I know many who are far more knowledgeable in this space will do much more research on it. But the recognition seems, at least at the moment, to be that this has come out of an area of China where there was great environmental degradation and social injustice and poverty. And even if that isn't entirely where it came from, we know that the pressure we are putting on the system today is such that society and the environment and wildlife are being shoved ever closer together. And we are just creating more and more environments where these things are going to come at us more and more. We are facing multiple pandemics in the years ahead, and not just disease pandemics, but the pandemic of climate change, of social inequality and injustice. We simply cannot ignore these things anymore. I am so grateful that, having left investment banking about 10 years ago, I haven't spent that time on the desert island, although I do recognize some of the points that Professor Watchman was pointing to. But now we recognize that these things are not add-ons, they are must-haves. We cannot continue in this way of complacency, as Paul has said. I penned a blog just the other week saying, talking about radical optimism, which seems like a slightly strange thing to say in that environment. But look at what's happened over the last year. A vaccine would typically take 10 years to be produced. In 1 year, due to unprecedented coming together of government and of industry and of finance and indeed need, we've managed to take from 10 years to 1 year. We've taken that whole decade, we've crammed it down by an order of magnitude, and we've got vaccines rolling out around the world today. That is amazing. What if we took that exact same approach to climate change? What if we saw climate change or social injustice or any of these other issues, and we applied that same lens? The UN has said this next 10 years is the decade of action. That means we've got 10 lots of 1 year. Now, if that tenfold increase was able to be reproduced, we've got a century's worth of development that we could put into all of these issues in 10 years. All of the change we've seen since the 1920s to today crammed into 10 years because we put the greatest of our efforts and resources into it. Think of the change we could make, the progress we could make towards the SDGs, towards equality, towards social justice, towards reducing the impact and the frequency of these future pandemics. We can be radically optimistic because we know what so many of those solutions look like. We're just not generally willing at the moment to put them in place. The pandemic put this in our faces, and we wanted to respond. Sadly, so many of these other issues, particularly for those of us in the West, in a more privileged position perhaps, don't see so many of these issues as in our face. So we don't put that same level of urgency. But we know what these solutions look like. So bringing these comments into land, Paul, the question was, what recommendation can be made to business? The simple answer is we need to look through this system lens. We need to move past shareholder value, the business of business is business. We need to move past shared value. We need to come to this concept of system value, as Future Fit describes it, where we recognize that we need to live within planetary and societal boundaries. And in fact, we need to not only come back in from the damage we're causing, we need to be regenerative. We need to be responsible in the way business is happening. But we know what this looks like. There are numerous pieces of research done. The Future Fit Business Benchmark that we've created is a toolkit to show companies how to get to and beyond this point. There are numerous things out there. We can do this. Anybody who sits on a stage and says, I don't know what the answer looks like, is because they've not opened their eyes to look for it. For sure, all the technology hasn't been created. There are many complexities. We're talking about wicked problems and super wicked problems, to use the phrase. They are by nature incredibly intrinsically difficult, but we know so much that we can do if only we would put that time, that effort, that resource into doing this. So we need to move beyond this concept of sitting around and nodding and agreeing that these are serious issues. We know what the solutions look like. Capital wants to flow into them. An increasing number of consumers and just ordinary people around the world want to see these changes happening. Business can make the decisions, can make the change. Investment can absolutely drive that change. And we can put all of this to work in the developing markets that so desperately need that support and help. Stop trashing so much of the planet and society. Let's turn the business model upside down. Let's start making profit because we're part of the solution and we're bringing these benefits of a positive business working inside the boundary conditions. That's the vision that Future Fit has. And I think that's the vision, Paul, that you've created through this wonderful series of talks. So I'm going to bring my comments to a conclusion there and hope that gives some food for thought for the rest of this. You're on mute, Paul.
You think after this long I'd have that ticked off. Look, Mon, thank you very much. But some of your points there link and bridge, I think, really effectively to one of the themes which has run through all of the dialogues. This morning, it's already come out, which is we will not deliver the SDGs unless we're in a position to flow finance and capital to those frontier markets where the intense pockets of poverty are, but also at the same time where the demographic bounce as envisaged in Africa exists, where Africa will go from 1.3 billion people now, after 2050, Africa's growth will be responsible for 80% of the growth of the world. The average age in Africa now is 21. It's not just about Africa, it's other parts of the developing world and the frontier economies. We have this huge battle to reorient and flow capital and finance into the entrepreneurs who exist in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Senegal, in Egypt, in Brazil, in you name it, those countries and companies. But that theme has kept coming back through this discussion. The system change, the standards change. How do we bring that capital and finance to, in many ways, the future of the world, certainly demographically and in a generational sense? Final point before I go to our next speaker, if I may, but for the deepest pools of capital in the developed, the G7, the G20 countries who've had, I guess, the longest standing insurance and pension pots, my feeling is there's a huge systemic risk evolving, and that is a systemic risk associated with not delivery of development and jobs and good jobs with dignity and empowering the communities and the entrepreneurs of the countries which are emerging and where the demographic bounce of the world will come from. And that, for long-term investors, is a risk which cannot be ignored. So look, the link there, and I'm delighted to have the Tony Elamulu Foundation on and a return guest from our first event in South Africa. So it's with great pleasure I welcome Ifeoma Okafor Obi, who is the Chief of Operations at the foundation based in Nigeria. And Ifeoma, I welcome back, but I understand that you're now, as the Tony Elamulu Foundation, supporting close to or maybe more than 10,000 entrepreneurs across Africa. We've got a complex pot of geopolitical issues, systemic change, getting money to people on the ground. Is it an inflection point? Isn't. So the floor is yours to give us a feeling from Nigeria and the broader African continent. So delighted to have you. The floor is yours, Ifeoma. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. So there are a couple of trends that, first and foremost, nobody expected the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, that's, and the impact that it would bring. I mean, as of February last year, everything was more or less, on track. Then the pandemic hit, a lot of businesses started facing challenges. And we noticed two very important trends. The first trend, of course, was that recognition of technology as a key enabler. So we found that the businesses that had technology as their backbone were surviving much better than businesses that didn't. And therefore, investments that were coming in, understandably, were going to businesses that had tech as a backbone. And so a lot of businesses across Africa, they're restructuring and they're making sure that they leverage technology to be able to, run their businesses. They've seen remote working works, and they've seen better ways of reaching their prime prospects, and they're doing that, they're changing their route to market. Now, another trend is government and financial industry all coming together and big partners to, reach out to help businesses from micro to medium to big, just to ensure that, businesses don't close down, there are no job losses. And, another thing is because a lot of businesses that source things offshore found that there was disruption in supply chain, a lot of businesses are trying to help smaller businesses to build the capability to be able to supply them locally. So, there are new ecosystems forming and businesses are doing, they're recovering. Now, one thing that I also noticed that was very interesting is that a lot of businesses are rethinking, the structure of their businesses and thinking of SDGs, how it affects the SDGs. And that's because in some of the businesses that had that focused on impact on SDGs were doing quite well. We know a lot of people that, who went into, making face masks and all that just to support other businesses, but they found out that at a point it was also profitable to do that. So, and that's one of the reasons why at the foundation, in addition to identifying, training, and empowering the right businesses, we also now, ask businesses to capture their impact of their SDGs, and we started reporting that because we found out that it's a very, very important to track, especially in Africa where we're not doing very well in SDGs. I mean, one of the best countries is Mauritania right now, and Mauritius right now, and they're on 66.7. And then we have about 18 sub-Saharan Africa countries that are not even up to 50%. So, businesses rethinking their model, making themselves more nimble to be able to survive, adding technology, and then a layer of taking the impact of SDGs is fantastic for us. Then, again, in terms of partnerships that we're seeing, lots of real value partnerships, and these are not partnerships anymore to just do handouts but really partnerships to create win-win and to make people stand on their own. And this is something that Tony and Glenn Foundation had been championing for a very long time. So we're focused on entrepreneurship because we know that not only do you empower the person, but each person you empower that opens a business is able to empower a minimum of 6 people. And then we have businesses that over the older businesses that started 2015, some of them have thousands of staff. And that also has a knock-on effect on the whole society. And then a lot of them are being seen as key, leaders in their organizations. And as a result of that, they're also doing drives, also training on entrepreneurship and just, impacting the society. So we've had, in the past 4 years, we've had our entrepreneurs in Forbes list, CNN African Voices, and other notable media. So we really believe that, entrepreneurship as a model works. And then the final trend that we've noticed is, investors are thinking differently of businesses that they want to, empower. So before it was businesses that was very clear that you could, look at, this is your balance sheet, you're going to be able to make money and all that. Now the thinking is different, and they're thinking of, not just the balance sheet, but the impact, environmental impact, social impact, which is very, very good. We have a lot of funds coming in, lots of different programs to help businesses coming up. We also, as a foundation, have our digital platform because we know that the key thing anybody in business in Africa needs is access. Access to world-class training, access to world-class mentoring, so that they don't make mistakes that others have made before, access to the right networks, and access to market. So we've, relaunched our platform, the TF Connect platform, which provides all of this to African entrepreneurs. And we started our 2021 drive, which would end 31st of March. And we're confident that we're going to be able to support more businesses to, thrive, and then create jobs, impact their communities, and just, let people live fulfilled lives, because that's really what they want. Thank you.
I'm having a bad afternoon. I need coffee or something, because that's the second mute failure on Zoom. Ifeoma, thank you very much for those comments. And it is a perfect segue. We're going from systems thinking to the entrepreneurial dimension and all of those basic things where if you strip out the jargon, it's what you said at the end. People want decent jobs and to be fulfilled and to live their lives. And, the small entrepreneurs are at the very heart of that ecosystem. So I'm going to bridge straight now to Carlos. So bear with Carlos Almiro. Carlos, forgive me. I've got too used to calling you Carlos.
Don't worry, Paul.
Carlos is based in Sao Paulo, so it's great to have Brazil on board this conversation. We've stretched from Tokyo to Brazil already today, and I mean I think there's a lovely synchronicity between what Ifeoma from Tona Elamulu said and the BRK Ambiental story. But if I can maybe set it up like this, I think I know BRK Ambiental from a business perspective, and we've had a conversation about sustainability going on for a few years now. And one of the things that I love about the story, Carlos, is that the legacy, the history of BRK Ambiental was that you were a company lifted out of a company where there was real problems and a scandal a few years back. It was the Odenbrecht story. And since that process of being lifted out and providing water and sanitation services to, I think it's 18 million people now, mainly in the northeast of Brazil, you have to serve both people who arrive home in helicopters to their penthouses, but also the people in the favelas. And that's part of your mandatory obligation. The key thing is you put sustainability at the very heart of the BRK Ambiental renewal story and work also with entrepreneurs, and you have a tremendous vision. So let me pass over to you before I say anything more. People don't need to hear from me, but Carlos, it's a real pleasure to have Brazil, BRK Ambiental on board, and the floor is yours, building on Ifeoma's comments from Africa and Nigeria.
Thank you, Paul, Professor King, Professor Watchman. It's a pleasure to be here. Paul, from an internal perspective, I think the COVID-19 is accelerating tendency in an unprecedented way, especially at BRK Ambiental. And in terms of corporate practice, we are seeing a big digital transformation. Companies are digitalizing, for example, its corporate university. We are creating our Netflix university, offering a huge content on demand, expanded learning opportunity for our employees. Also, home office is a reality in terms of, and the practice was accelerated by the pandemic. And I would like to highlight from the human side, developing social emotional skills among employees became a key element for the new normal society. Before the pandemic, these skills were not widespread at companies, but the pandemic had exposed the real need of improving skills such as self-control, social competence, perseverance, and problem-solving ability. But it's not important. I think the central point here, Paul, is in terms of the impacts of the pandemic and the corporate response to assist poor communities. Generally speaking, the pandemic in Brazil has mobilized private social investments as never seen before. Companies in Brazil have donated around 5.5 billion reais at current exchange rates, around $1 billion, to support poor communities and leverage health system capacity. But it's not enough. Another thing that I would like to highlight to you is the social inequality and its connections with the pandemic impact. Take a look, for example, in the north of Brazil, 10% of the ICU beds is now occupied by sanitation-related disease. It's incredible. So we don't have capacity to treat COVID-19 because the lack of the essential service, in this case, sanitation, produced a big constraint in terms of health capacity. And I think in Brazil, and I imagine most developing countries, the health crisis has been exposed how the lack of essential service, such as sanitation, as I mentioned before, and clean water, potentialized the impacts, especially for poor communities. For the utilities sector, this reality was rapidly observed. Power and sanitation companies, such as BRK, as a providers of essential service, had to maintain the supply and, in parallel, support and engage communities to mitigate risks in terms of delinquency rates and other operational issues. We are learning how to work with last mile communities. It's a big challenge for all companies, especially in Brazil. This reality has shown the real necessity of incorporating new approaches to engage and have business with the base of social economy pyramid. For instance, in BRK, we developed a partnership with the American NGO Water.org to provide access to clean water and sanitation for poor communities. The project offers social and environmental education and affordable credits for basic sanitation infrastructure, such as bathroom, water tanks, and connections to water and wastewater system. But Paul, on the other hand, we still have problems to scale solutions to help deliver SDGs. I think this is the central point here. In Brazil, we have a lot of problems, especially in terms of access of essential service, as I mentioned. And I think that we have a big opportunity to deliver innovative investment approaches, especially for poor communities, aligning to SDG that can be replicated at scale for the country. The Mawezi option in Kenya is a big opportunity for Brazil, for example. So following this purpose, we can learn from other global experience. For example, the experience for Nigeria that could be replicated in Brazil, and joint partnerships. Firstly, from my opinion, firstly to design market solution for Brazilian last mile communities, and finally, mobilizing capital for these opportunities. These new approaches, Paul, will be a mandatory aspect to widespread social and financial inclusion, and more important, to close the gap of inequality. It will also contribute, for example, to mitigate risks of climate change that, as we know, widely impact poor communities. In this sense, as I mentioned, we have a lot of opportunities, such as Mawezi option in Kenya. In addition, I think that this innovative solution could be potentialized if we take in consideration the digital revolution. I do believe that the digital revolution has opened an opportunity to rapidly widespread innovative investment approaches across the company. The current credit and financial models in Brazil offered by traditional banks sometimes were not able to reach last mile communities. In this sense, the fintechs and credit solutions based in cashless approach in electronic distribution platforms represent a great opportunity. So having the digital revolution, we could adapt, and embed a proven and profitable last mile business model for our clients. The project in partnership with Water.org, it's a good example. So Paul and dear colleagues, we have global experience in hands, and I believe that a real partnership occurs when the company, like BRK, is capable to design affordable credits and products to have a sustainable business with last mile communities. Also, these partnerships must be scalable across the country and possible be replicated with minor adjustments for distinct local realities. In Brazil, Paul, we have good examples that show us that it's possible to enhance SDGs with sustainable and scalable solution. We have examples, especially the ones related to Amazon sustainable exploitation. We can learn, for example, by the experience from Natura Corporation. They do business with Amazon last mile communities, generating income, preserving the forest, and improving sustainable production. They have a scalable model implemented in other communities across the country. So we can take advantage. In Brazil, we can take advantage of our sustainable potential and use it to enhance SDG and reduce the inequality gap. So that's all, Paul, and I'm available here for further questions. And again, it was a pleasure to be here today.
Carlos, that's a marvelous presentation. And let me give a footnote of just maybe explanation in terms of the Mwezi option. So BRK and a company based in Kenya have an ongoing conversation, which is focused on the Mwezi, which means moonlight in Swahili, is a profitable last mile distributor of solar energy and productive agricultural technologies. That's essentially an asset-backed financial institution now, providing credit mainly to 250,000 people in the Lake Victoria area of Kenya, in and around Kisumu. Very centric, local, centric in its focus, and using all of the technologies that Ifeoma has referenced, whether it's digital or fintech, but it is a for-profit company with social purpose. It does climate change, it does agricultural productive technologies, so it lifts and empowers families. And BRK Ambiental has a conversation with Mwezi, which I think is a beautiful example of collaboration for a last mile distribution model to be taken and maybe embedded in Brazil to serve the communities in the favelas and those last mile communities. So Carlos, wonderful presentation again, and you know, giving us examples of hope of things happening. And as you say, how do you replicate, how do you scale, how do you deliver on the SDGs? It has to be Professor King's favorite SDG, which is 17, partnership and collaboration. I hope you don't mind the literary license, Professor King. So good, again, thank you, Carlos. Let me just catch up to where we are. Now, I've got a proposal here, because it's at this stage, Alexandra Noble was going to come in and respond to the panel, but Alexandra has very kindly agreed to take a speaking spot in the next panel after one of our Japanese guests withdrew. So Alexandra, my proposal is that why don't we take a few hovering minutes here to have an intra-panel discussion. You could kick off. Maybe people have questions. Maybe Paul Watchman has a question for Carlos, or Ifeoma has a question for Martin Rich, or Mervyn has a question for all of us. So what I would suggest is we just hover for a few minutes. The conversation is rich and we've got more in store. But Alexandra, if you were to give us maybe just a couple of minutes of your reflection on that first panel, but then let's open it up and see if we can have a conversation. So anyone with questions for anyone, if anyone wants a piece of Carlos's business, or they want to embed Martin Rich on their board for the next 20 years, that can happen. So let's do that if you're open to that, Alexandra, and then we'll close panel one and we'll move on to panel two. So Alexandra, over to you for some brief reflections, and then let's open it up. And please use the chat function or your hand if you want to question one of the other panelists. Alexandra, to start.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, I have to say I haven't noted my 10 points from the session today as I did this morning. But I think what's so absolutely amazing and encouraging, and I think particularly where I sit here in the UK, just to hear both this morning and this afternoon about all the wonderful things that are going on, and to feel confident that despite this awful pandemic, there are lots of silver linings, and to hear all the stories has been the most enormous encouragement to me. And I suspect that we in the UK are not quite as far down the line perhaps as some other countries who, you know, when I hear your stories about Nigeria, Brazil, this morning when we were hearing about some things that were going on in India, it's just spectacular and really exciting. So I think that's my summary really, is not to get into the specifics, but to be really encouraged. And I just hope and pray that people in the UK get this message, because it is such an encouragement. And You know, it is only by collaboration, integrated thinking, which Professor King mentioned earlier, but only with collaboration across the world globally are we going to really move forward and make this a better world for our children and grandchildren. And that's absolutely critical in my view. So I think I won't say any more at this point, Paul. I think it'd be great to have some input, and I'm sure you're going to moderate some questions around the table.
Yes, indeed. Let's take a few moments and just one connection point while people think, or maybe you've got a question. The Mawezi model that Carlos references, we've got an ongoing process to look at zones and regions of intense poverty in the UK, where we think potentially that same model could apply. I'm talking Middlesbrough, and you talk about the UK as a G7 country and it's developed. But there is intense, and I know Paul Watchman knows this, intense poverty, intense structural decline in these countries where, again, these models could apply. So it's that cross-fusion, in many different parts of the world, which I think is remarkable. But let me open it up. Anyone has a question for another panelist or would like to make a point or a point of clarification, please let me know with your hand or with the chat function. Carlos,
just a general question. I would like to hear from my colleagues. What is the central point when you try to scale solutions such as Mawezi? What is the mandatory question that we need to deliver to address scalable solutions?
Carlos, can I direct that one, if I may, initially to Dinao, who is one of our investment people who's hands-on with private equity and fund delivery in South Africa, but has a very good, I think, appreciation of it's that scaling, not just of a business, but of an idea. So Dinao, would you mind taking that one to start with? And then I'll go to Ifeoma as well.
Not a problem, Paul. Carlos, very wonderful presentation earlier on, by the way, and very energetic. I think what we need to look at to start making solutions scalable, firstly, is moving it from an idea to becoming a proven solution that has some kind of a track record. And I think that's why we have different players, and that's why we need ecosystems, because in the earlier stages, potentially someone like the Tony Elumelu Foundation would be very keen to fund a concept and take risk in incubating it and getting it to a point where it's a proven solution, it's got a bit of history to it. And then it comes into, in fact, what I'm going to be talking about, which is the role of private markets in scaling solutions that we need to create more resilient economic systems going forward. And, the private markets typically would require some kind of a track record, whether it's venture capital or private equity, where a lot of DFIs, development financial institutions, as well as pension funds are invested. And I think that's where really we need to be looking at getting a lot of solutions too, because that's where the large amounts of capital are available, which can really make a difference in scaling up a lot of solutions. And I think Martin also referred to that earlier on. So it's really bridging that gap of taking solutions from very initial stages to where they can be ready for the larger capital base, because that's really where we can talk about scaling on a global level, or that kind of dimension. Back to you, Paul.
Fantastic. Let me flip that across to Ifeoma, and then Mervyn, I don't know if you or Martin or Paul, any thoughts or questions, or Alexandra. So Ifeoma, on that question of scale, where you're first risk takers in some ways as the foundation, right?
Yes. Okay, so we fall the bottom of the pyramid, and every year over 30% of our applications are businesses at idea stage. So we always ask 3 questions. Number 1, do you have an idea that is based on sound, do you have a good idea? Is it based on, like correct, insights and all? And can you prove that it can work? And which is why we take our time to take you through the training that you need to be able to really distill the idea, like literally peel it like an onion to the bulb to be sure that this is an idea that works. And then when you've done that, we then give you this seed capital to be able to prove that it works, and then also give you access to mentoring, because if you're trying to scale, you need to go from an envisioning mindset to a scaling mindset. It's a big shift to do, right? So we give you a network, then like-minded individuals still going to the same problems that you're going to in groups, so you can have good conversations. It's when you've done this, you've proven that you have an idea, it's based on the right insights, and it can work, and you have a few little numbers to show some traction. Then you have the right mentorship to be able to help you with the paradigm shift you need. Then you can when you go to any fund, that you're able to get the next level. And we find that a lot of people don't want to take that risk, because the risk of business failure is quite high, and that's why we actually play at that bottom, because we feel that everyone should have equal opportunity to be able to bring their ideas to life. So I hope I was able to answer what you wanted.
Ifeoma, thank you very much indeed. Look, at a footnote, I don't know if there are any other questions out there or thoughts, but I mentioned this morning. One of our portfolio businesses, Sub-Saharan Africa, agricultural value chain based, got that track record that you talk about, Dinao. Profitable, numbers look good, scalable, all those things. But the conversations with mainstream finance to secure debt growth capital, I mean, you come at it simply because you're in an African country. This has been our experience, and you're starting behind the curve, and that's both with domestic finance and the bigger houses, and that's wrong, and it must be a huge frustration. So I'm not saying it's a disaster, but our experience on the ground is you can have the business, the numbers, the arrows are all in the right direction, the model is sustainable, it's verified after 4 or 5 years, but because you're coming from a place where you're serving last mile customers with some discretionary income or peri-urban customers, it becomes a very difficult conversation. And I would love, and I'm sure you've got much more experience than I have, but to change that conversation, Africa doesn't immediately become a negative in the finance conversation is really important. So Dinao and Ifeoma, do we have any other questions or hands up or thoughts or clarifications?
Paul,
sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say perhaps Martin should go first. He beat me to the buzzer.
Oh okay. No, Paul, you go for it, and then we'll.
Okay. It's something that Carlos said. At least I think you said. You described something as a Netflix university, and I thought that was a really important comment, because we're talking about technological change. We're talking about interconnectivity. Now, I lectured at university full time for some years, and I still do lectures. And one of the interesting things that has come out of the pandemic is this idea of that lecturers actually record the lectures and conduct their tutorials by online. And it's fascinating, because I was thinking about issues like social mobility, inequality, and the fact that you can achieve a great deal. We did have the Open University, we still have the Open University in Britain, but we didn't have the mainstream universities participating in providing online services that can be, someone from Cambridge could be picked up in Bogota, and someone from Bogota could be picked up in Tanzania, etc. And you could have some of the best educational programs coming out of this. And it was also something Martin was saying about this whole idea of how you connect things together. And his colleague this morning was talking about a sat-nav for sustainability. And I just love that phrase. And it describes how we get from A to B, and that we've got a choice of different routes. And some are quicker than others, some are more scenic, some have got different things to offer. But I do think when we look at the way in which the vaccine has been developed by scientists cooperating throughout the world, that conversations like this are so important. Because I was just thinking about the fact that as a university lecturer, if they came to me in the old days and said, Paul, we'd like you to do a series of lectures online, and we will then broadcast. I said, but you lose the charisma, the theatre that I bring to these things. And no, you don't. You actually have what Paul is saying. You edit down the material to something that is very, very good. And then you share it. You share it throughout the world. You have some of the best lecturers in the world talking about the subject, perhaps creating an enthusiasm for someone in Vietnam about some form of parasite that can be attacked in various ways. So I thank you very much, and I have already taken various rights out, intellectual property rights, on Netflix University. I'd never heard that phrase, and it's so good. And we might ask Netflix for some money in the end, Carlos. And if there's a little bit, I'll filter it back to you.
You, Carlos, you've just been done, but that's fine. Martin, did you have your hand up? We'll make this the final question. We're going to panel 2. But Paul, thank you for that. And now, Ifeoma, Martin, did you have a question?
It was actually more, just wanted to throw one more thought in to Carlos's question. And I think a critical point of scale, and this maybe is teaching people to suck eggs, but so many entrepreneurs forget it, is having scale built in on day one in terms of where you want to end up. When I was first redeeming my soul from investment banking, which was a long purge, I can assure you, I spent a few years raising capital in the impact investment space. And time again, we saw fantastic but small projects that would come along and prove themselves. And the inherent belief in the entrepreneur was big pension schemes, or fill in the big funder, should, for Reed will, fund this. And it's kind of like, because I've done it and it works and it's good and it's got this impact, people will come along and fund it. And as we all know, the sad reality is the world doesn't work that way. And actually starting from a point of understanding exactly where you need to get that funding. And I completely echo your comments that unfortunately to many, Africa is another hurdle that people need to cross, or probably, Carlos, Brazil. I have less experience there, but knowing where you are going so you have that trajectory but built in from day one, I just cannot express enough how critical that is to be built into the plans, so that you're ticking those boxes, crossing those hurdles, so that when you get to that point, the bank, the pension scheme, the whoever will come in and fund that scale.
Mon, thank you for that. And I can't resist that. But when I had my first company in Bangkok in '91 called the Environmental Business Group, and we were a little startup. But there was an American friend who I was very envious of, who had a company serving market information to the large motor manufacturers. And my point here is his company logo was the Chinese character, which essentially was, if you know where you're going to, everything else will fit into place, right? And that was the logo, and they did it beautifully. So that you kicked a synapse in my head in terms of that point: scale, know where you're going through. And Ifeoma and Dino, you've made it very clear in terms of, you know, that need for direction and building scale in. Let's move on, and we're going on to the next panel. So you know, the wheels are not quite down yet, but we're heading towards the runway. Which is good. And again, Carlos, thank you for your input. What I'd suggest here is, Alexandra, if you don't mind, I'm going to go in the first speaker in the next panel will be Dino from Maya Capital and from the Third Way Investment Partnership and Maya Capital in South Africa. We've got Gordon Noble online in Australia, and Lord knows what time it is there. But I would then go from Dino to Gordon for his comments, and Alexandra, come to you in terms of the third speaker on this panel. So with your forbearance, that's what I'm going to do. So Dino from Maya Capital, the floor is yours, and we'd love to hear your story. And Maya is a fantastic story. So over to you. And Gordon, I hope you're still awake. I can see your name, but not your face, but you're on watch. Dino, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good evening from South Africa. I think, you know, the event has been quite exciting. I joined the morning session as well. And I must say from the previous session, the synchronicities are, I think, one of the things that are energizing. It seems like we have more leaders thinking in a similar direction, and hopefully that will take us to where we ought to be going. I think if I try and answer the question of how business and investment communities are preparing for the new normal, the first thing that I'd like to offer is that as business and investment communities in South Africa, we have a responsibility to actually shape that new normal and not only to respond to it. We have two, I think, very critical areas of attention that we need to look at. One is unemployment, especially youth unemployment, which has also been highlighted in the Global Risk Report of 2021 to be quite a critical risk that needs to be attended to. The second thing is that we've been talking quite repeatedly about the unsustainable inequalities that have become a systemic risk. And that's owing to a number of things. And I think that as business, we have an opportunity to design systems that will enable us to have sustainable societies and sustainable cities. And you know, what that looks like essentially is a community that has access to their critical basic services, such as education, housing, energy, connectivity, as well as healthcare. Having societies that have access to employment opportunities within the economy, and also having a very strong SME market that promotes entrepreneurship. You know, that kind of an ecosystem starts becoming where we have our populations becoming productive and not dependent of a system, and therefore being able to take sustainability into each, you know, into each one's own hands. As Maya Capital, you know, when we were launching our business last year, we came into a very uncertain economic situation. The COVID pandemic had just hit, and we had designed ourselves as an impact private debt fund, where we're looking to use mezzanine debt as an instrument because we believe that that helps to unlock the capital structures, especially around quite a number of the risks that you've been mentioning, where commercial banks may not be comfortable with taking an exposure unless the equity base is of a particular level. So we come in to make that impact. But when we came in, we found that the investment themes that we had created were actually responding to what was becoming even more glaringly obvious as the inequalities that we have in our society. We're raising a $200 million fund that is looking to invest in gender inclusion, clean technology, financial inclusion, and within the social infrastructure construct, we specifically targeting affordable healthcare, housing, and education. And we designed our investment themes very deliberately around creating what we call an ecosystem that we think will help to address the critical needs of society. And you know, our approach generally is that we have to use ecosystems as a way in which we respond to the economic challenges. And what has then come out even stronger in 2021, given that the economic situation is worsening, when we thought that, you know, hopefully the pandemic would start stabilizing, I think we're starting to get more data, but basically it's telling us that we still have quite a bit of uncertainty to deal with. But one of the things that are very clear is that unemployment is a big challenge. And this has been expressed also by quite a number of industry leaders. Our chairman as well is quite concerned about it. And he keeps asking the question, are we going to be able to make a difference to society? Is what we're doing making a difference to society? And I think this is the mindset that we all have got to embrace as part of the solution to how we change the economic constructs to become a lot more sustainable. But in terms of the ecosystem approach that we use, we're looking to crowd in capital, corporates, and society into our investment decisions. By mobilizing capital from pension funds, we're able to then focus a lot of the attention on, you know, investing and therefore realizing the inclusive economy that we believe is possible. by using capital sustainably and still retaining a competitive return to it. And we operate in the private market industry, and I think one of the things that has been quite commendable in South Africa and the world over is how private markets have taken quite a lot of the solutions that the traditional financing sources would not finance and helped to prove them to a point where quite a number of them have been scaled up, and a lot more needs to be scaled up if we're going to have an economic construct where households have access to basic services. So the role of private market industries in that ecosystem becomes quite critical, because we are looking to enable moving capital from the pension funds into the areas of investment where it will also be making a direct impact on society as the capital generates returns for the investors through those investments. And I think thirdly, the other pillar that we diligently look at is how we're making a difference to society. And I think this is also going to increase quite a lot, where we see the measurement of impact that is achieved through any particular investment becoming quite critical. There are reporting standards even internationally that are coming up aligned to the SDG goals that are aiming to look at how we can measure that impact. And I think also importantly for us is that in that ecosystem where we're mobilizing how the impact reaches society, with how capital still continues to become sustainable and to grow so that we do have, available capital for future investments. We also very importantly have found that the impacts that we seek to make and which will help to change the economic construct does not require that investors have to sacrifice a return to achieve that impact. If anything, I've found that the investment opportunities that are looking a lot more attractive in the current economic situation are the very ones which are making an impact directly to society, and where we also need to be investing, to grow the investor capital. And let me use an example of one of the investment opportunities that we're currently looking at, and the potential multitude of returns that could come out of it. That demonstrates how working in ecosystems could have a multiplier effect. And it's quite interesting because this has come out in, I think, almost every panelist, that clean technology is one of the key enablers to, I think, building a new economic reality and what the new normal is going to look like. In our case, we have a lot of households that do not have access to consistent energy across the income bands. We have a utility grid that is under a lot of pressure, and as a result, off-grid solutions are becoming more and more an alternative. And in rolling out clean technology solutions, we would be helping to build, to enable green buildings and to therefore build sustainable cities. But at the same time, this enables households to have more security of energy supply. The kind of rollout of such infrastructure in itself creates a lot of employment opportunities, and it also creates a lot of opportunities for SMEs. And at the same time, the returns to corporates are very competitive, especially in the markets that we find ourselves in. And by therefore, as a mezzanine debt fund, catalyzing investment to go into this kind of a solution, we're looking for these kind of multitude of returns, and we would be measuring ourselves not only on the financial return, but also how we are making an impact on employment and on access to energy and those kind of impact layers as well. And I think really, Paul, what this is saying is that we're looking for investors to become more conscious in the decisions that they make and where they direct the capital. First and foremost, because we need a lot of capital to be directed to these kind of solutions that are going to help us to build sustainable societies. But at the same time, these are solutions that are offering very attractive returns. So investors don't have to make a sacrifice on the return to make an impact. Equally so, we have a very unique opportunity by working through these kind of ecosystems to address the SDG goals and some of the top global risks that have been highlighted, such as climate change, unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And I think if we can scale these kind of approaches where we attract a lot of the pension funds and the DFIs on a large scale to invest in these solutions by investing through private market funds such as us that are willing and able to do the hard yards of going and looking for those opportunities that make a direct impact on society, then we have an opportunity that on a global scale, we can really scale up impactful investment opportunities that truly help us to have sustainable societies and sustainable cities, while also still sustaining capital and ensuring that our investors are able to generate a competitive investor return. So I do hope that we will see increased attention to investing in emerging markets and in particular supporting private markets, because research has also shown that they have performed better than listed stocks for quite a while as well. So the investment case is quite clear. I think it's really just growing the awareness of the investor community that will give us an opportunity to shape the kind of new normal that we would like to see where we have sustainable societies. Thank you.
I've done it again. That's my hat trick of mute crimes. So Dina, thank you for those wonderful comments and analysis and assessment. I mean, absolutely on the nail. And it brought me back to your business partner, I guess, John Oliphant, when he was the CEO of the Government Employees Pension Fund in South Africa, which was and is, I think, by far the biggest fund in Africa. That was 138 billion. I'm not sure what it is now, but dollars. He always made the point about the need for Africa to create safe harbors, and maybe safe harbors through the use of exchanges, but as a method to tease and tempt the large institutional investors into both the exchanges as safe harbors, but then into private markets. And that always resonated with me. And your wonderful description of where Maya is and what you're doing, I think is absolutely groundbreaking. So look, thank you. I will move on to the next speaker. And I'm going to ask Gordon Noble. Gordon, is that dawn I can see over your shoulders in Australia, or what time have you got there now?
No, it's about 3:30, Paul. It's just got the light on in the background. So
okay, good.
It's a little late, fair to say, but
Gordon, let me back up for just 1 second. Dino, I know Professor King would really appreciate your use of the word conscious. So the conscious capital corporate society, I think, was something which would resonate deeply with Professor King, who always talks about conscious leadership. But sorry about that, Gordon. Back to you. 3:30 in the morning. The floor is yours, Australia.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. Look, what I might do is I'll reflect on a couple of the comments that we had at the start of the conversation, and then some of the solutions. So Professor Watchman really started the conversation around, I guess, a theme around time, and it came out with a couple of conversations. Professor Watchman talked about it at an investment bank 20 years ago. Professor King, we had a conversation around a future sustainability standards board, and just the time that it's taken to get ESG, and it's a relatively short period of time, I guess over the last 20 years. And Martin Rich talked about time in the sense of the SDGs, it's the next 10 years. And even Paul, you talked about, if we're going to meet the SDGs, we need to invest in frontier markets. I want to go back, using that reference of time, go back not just 20 years, but go back 100 years. So if you go back to 1920 in Australia, and I suspect this would be very similar in the United Kingdom and maybe other jurisdictions, but and my comments will be around the financial system in particular, but the financial system in 1920 looked very different than it did in the year 2000 or 2020. We had a federal government owned bank that had just been established. We had a state savings bank. We had a private sector, private banks, but we also had a very vibrant mutual sector, which included cooperatives, friendly societies, and a lot of the life insurance companies were mutuals. Now, that diversity between the government, the private, and if you like that middle, has really disappeared over the last 100 years, to the point now where most of the financial system is simply government or private. And we have a lot of government involved in sovereign wealth funds, for instance. You also go back even 25 years here in Australia, we had 6 stock exchanges. So the idea that we had these big liquid markets is only really a new construct, if you like. It's only really emerged over time. And that's one of the challenges, that as you get these large stock exchanges, we have these conversations around liquidity, and everybody needs to find those deep pools. So they're all drawn to those deeper and deeper pools, and they're drawn away from effectively their local markets. In terms of solutions, there were 3 really resonated with me. Firstly, Martin's comments around radical optimism, and I think what we saw with the vaccine really demonstrated what we can do. And to be honest, it just shows and Ithioma talked about partnership and how different parties have come together, not just in terms of vaccine, but in terms of governments and financial system parties working together. I think that optimism, I think there's a lot of reason to be confident that we can do things. So we just need to, what I'm drawn to is, what are the mechanisms, the structural mechanisms that may be missing that we should be thinking about? And Carlos, your comments around skills, and particularly I think that Netflix University and these ideas around innovative investment, I think that's something that we can draw out. So where I was getting to with all of that is there's two areas I'd like to focus on. The first one is around that skills issue, because we had in the first conversation earlier this morning, as it was in your time, Paul, we had a conversation with a sovereign wealth fund talking about there are challenges around their knowledge, the lack of knowledge around frontier markets. And it seems to me that with the digital revolution that we're talking about, and Paul referenced the idea of how universities have moved to do online learning, seems to me that there's a need for some sort of frontier finance academy. There's a need to be creating that mechanism so that there is the platform, so that institutional investors, there is effectively no excuse. Picking up the language that if that radical optimism, if we're genuinely interested in meeting the SDGs, and we genuinely recognise that to do that, you've got to invest in frontier economies, then you've got to then at least start to go on that learning journey and understand what your impediments might be. And there needs to be some sort of mechanism to do that. And I know that in terms of initiatives such as the Principles of Responsible Investment that Paul, obviously, we've been involved in, that's an area that hasn't been a feature of their work, and I think that's an area that needs to be more focus on. The second, I guess, idea to put on the table is there's been a lot of conversation when we talk about investment, we talk about equity, and I think it's worth talking about debt. And in the context of frontier markets, and Paul, you could really describe some of the challenges in terms of debt that, for instance, companies such as Malaysia have dealt with. But it's not just the access to the equity side of an equation. It's the fact that debt is uneven in terms of its interest rate. There's roughly $15 trillion US dollars of money in the world that has negative yields, as in that money is not even getting a positive interest rate. And yet some of the interest rates that we're getting in frontier economies are in excess of the 25% for a housing mortgage, let alone some individuals who are facing in the poorest situations to get access to finance may pay interest rates of 200%, and that happens in the US in marginalized communities. So I think that's the issue, where if we go back to those structures that we had 100 years ago, So the building societies, the friendly societies, all the things that really came together to address some of those impediments. We're in a different era today, but we need to think of what, going to Ifeoma's comments about partnership, what kind of mechanisms can we create that have that partnership address some of these issues around the cost of credit, the actual cost of debt? Because I think if we can address those two things, creating that partnership with the institutional investors to give them the access so that there's no more excuses, oh, we don't do this, we only invest in these markets. Okay, we need a mechanism to provide that, if you like, that canal so that we start to get the flow of water into frontier markets. So there needs to be some sort of knowledge building exercise in that way. But secondly, I'd focus on debt as well. I think the equity is critical, but as we know, with institutional investment, debt and equity go hand in hand. So I think there's a lot that can be done with $15 trillion of negative yields in the world. There's a lot that can be done by partnering credit guarantees, for example. So we use the tools that we've learned the financial system has developed over the last 20, 30 years. And I think there's a lot that we could do in that regard. I'll leave it there, Paul.
Gordon, always challenging, always right on the edge and right on the nail. Really wonderful comments. And I'm from Liverpool, and if you go down to the sort of the waterfront in Liverpool, there's 3 buildings called the Three Graces, which were the great custom houses and financial buildings. But if you look at the architecture there of what was one of the world's great merchant cities back in the day, I love the fact that you can see buildings were cut into the sandstone. It's the Liverpool Stock Exchange, and it's the Cotton Exchange. And that idea of local capital accumulation, I think, is so important in terms of connectivity to the society that you're investing in. I know in Turkey, they have a very interesting set of city-based stock exchanges, I think partly because of that reason. And so they're wonderful comments, and they help put a thread through a lot of our discussions. I'm sure Dina relates to it, and Ifeoma relates to that in terms of, the need for that local capital accumulation, and Carlos, obviously. So look, thank you, Gordon. As ever, for the sake of full disclosure, Gordon is our Australian partner in the Blended Capital Group. When I left the UN in 2012, I wanted to go back into business, but I have had an obsession with for me, sustainability is where equality, equity, and infrastructure come together, and that provision of basic services and the importance of infrastructure, not the huge pieces, but from off-grid distributed infrastructure, hybrid natural infrastructure. And Gordon, I believe you're one of the great thinkers around what the future of infrastructure should be. So as ever, thank you for your comments. I know you've got a couple of essays coming down the line, and we will share them amongst this community when they're baked. So no spoiler alert, I won't give any of your secrets away, but it's wonderful stuff. So let me jump across as, again, we, the wheels are coming down. Professor King and Professor Watchman and you, Gordon, have had very long days, and we do appreciate the commitment. But I want to go to Alexandra Noble, who's nobly stepped in to Izumi-san's speaking spot. And Alexandra, the floor is yours after another really rich conversation. So Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to live dangerously here as I haven't got a brief and I didn't have time to prepare a lot of comments. But I just am so encouraged, as I said earlier, in terms of the conversations we've had both this morning and this afternoon about, how we can move forward. And wearing one of my hats at Pensions for Purpose, the company was formed about 3 years ago and is a thought leadership platform on investing with impact. And for that, I would also say investing intentionally. And so we have a lot of relationships, and I was really interested in the comments from Dina about the way you're thinking and the way you're investing. And it's one of the things that we are doing at Pensions for Purpose is spending a great deal of time with pension funds currently at the moment in the UK, although we've also, interestingly, got a relationship now with some pension funds in Australia who are keen to be part of our platform. But one of the things that we are doing is spending a lot of time on the education stroke training piece. And so what we are doing is spending time with both with asset managers who are creating product to sell, that terrible word, sell, but creating product, but also with the pension funds and helping them think through the SDGs and how they can align both their thinking and their investments with the SDGs. And I'm surprised really that it's only, you know, in the last couple of years we've been doing that, but I'm encouraged that pension funds really are beginning to get the bit between their teeth and start to understand that they've got to think differently. And I think that we've talked a lot about the new normal. I'm not quite sure whether normal is a word we can use anymore, because I don't actually believe the new normal is sort of suggests that there's going to be something left over from the past. And I feel that, you know, hearing people talking about entrepreneurship and how important that is going to be going forward across the world, and particularly both in Africa and Brazil, with, you know, across the world, I think we need to start dropping the normal word and just be creative and find a new, think outside the box and think of a new term for where we go from here, because it is going to be very different. And it's very, as I said earlier, very exciting to see what's happened as a result of the pandemic in terms of the vaccines and how there has been that cooperation and collaboration. And I hope that there'll be that sort of collaboration in the financial markets as well, because it's only then, as I think several of us have said, it's only then that we're going to start moving capital into the right places. So I'm really encouraged by this conversation, and I'm hoping that, I'm sure Paul has got some ideas about how we manage to get that message out beyond these meetings, but it's been hugely helpful and educational. One of the other things, the other hats that I wear, is that I spend a lot of my time mentoring what I describe as the next generation of leaders. That's in the UK, not across the world. But I think I'm really excited by how a lot of that next generation, and I'm sure that both Professor King and sorry, accidentally muted myself. I'm sure they see that in a lot of the people they're seeing when they're lecturing. The enthusiasm and it's such an encouragement to see these young people thinking outside the box, and they clearly are going to make the difference that we all need to see. So I think from the UK point of view, as I mentioned, I think we are quite a long way behind, but I think that we are beginning to move in the right direction. We really are taking ESG seriously, particularly on the social front. I think the difference I've seen in the last 6 months, I would say, of how pension funds are beginning to realize that they've got to have more focus on the social, on the ESG piece. And I think that we've got to find ways, and I know Future Fit is working hard on this as well. We've got to find ways of being able to make an assessment of what those social differences are really going to be to the funds. And I think one of the other interesting things in the UK is that I've found with a lot of the local government funds, which we have here in the UK, both the funds that have been pooled, but also the local government funds, are really keen to think about how they can invest locally to make a difference. And so it's quite interesting that councillors, for example, that are sitting on a local council, they know that a difference is going to be made to their life in terms of their constituents when suddenly there's a new social housing thing in their local district. So I think we are beginning to really move the story, move it forward, which is hugely encouraging. And I think that one of the things that actually our friend from Japan mentioned this morning was the digital revolution, the digital solution. And the fact that we're all sitting on this Zoom call now, again, is another encouragement. And I hope that that will also help us look more closely from an investment perspective to the frontier markets. And we certainly need to be we certainly need to be doing that. It's something that I've been interested in a long time as in my previous life as a fund manager. So I won't, I think, go on much longer, Paul. I think this is a really encouraging session, both this morning and this afternoon. I think there's lots of things we can all take away from it. I'm really encouraged to see that we've got this global community that is going to make things happen. And I think that just going back to this morning, the collaboration, transformation, education were three of the topics that I highlighted this morning. And I think that actually that is probably at the top of the list for all of us to focus on to take this forward. And I'm really looking forward to how you take these conversations into the UN, Paul, with your team, to see whether we can really make a difference in this next 9 years, particularly thinking about the SDGs and making them happen. Thanks. You're on mute, Paul. Paul, you're on mute.
Who was it who said if you do the same thing time after time, you know the rest of it, right? Look, thank you. Wonderful comments again and capture, and thank you for stepping in and, what's the American expression? Stepping up to the plate at the last minute and giving us those views and your experience. Some good news. I've just had the figures in from the UN for Thursday's 2 sessions. Again, we're doing 2 sessions for the time zones. So as of now, we have 308 participants registered for the first call and 289 registered for the second call. That's from the UN's World Investment Forum. So we've already got an audience to take some of these messages into from our process over the last 8 years. And before I go to Professor Watchman and Judge Professor King for the closing comments, let me again paint the picture that really this started with a conversation with the UN in South Africa, the resident coordinator, who basically is the #1 UN person representing all the agencies. So a wonderful lady from Kenya, Nardis Bekele Thomas. And we were working with her and her team to try and help her catalyze a flash appeal for $136 million back last February, March in response to COVID for expenditure across 17 UN agencies in South Africa. That's the start point. If I come on almost a year, we had a presentation from the UN just last week, and they described the specifics of what they're doing in the South African context with what's called a district development model, and that how over the next 5 years they decided to focus on 3 of the poorest provinces. One of them being Limpopo, the second being Modimolle, forgive me for my pronunciation, and the third being OR Tambo. Now, off the back of that, we decided to take our discussions over the last 8 months and produce something called the Waterberg Declaration. That's what will go to the UN on Thursday. And all it is it's a distillation of these conversations. So my challenge over the next 24 hours is to take the draft and embed what we have here. And my challenge also is to keep that declaration practical, pragmatic, not too aspirational, but how do we make the money move and grow good ideas and reach the last mile? That's the challenge. So I think, you've all participated in that. Professor King and Professor Watchman have anchored it fantastically for over a year. There's lots of thank yous there. I don't want this to be a wedding, but the one point from this segment I'd like you to take away is the Waterberg Declaration is based on an area of great natural beauty. I don't know it. I'm sure our South African friends do. That it is a place of both stunning beauty, but also pockets of poverty. And my feeling was to choose Waterberg rather than Modimolle or OR Tambo was that anywhere in the world can relate to those 2 words, water and mountain, Waterberg. So that will stay open between January the 28th and December of 2021, when the UN's World Investment Forum hopefully will meet in person in Abu Dhabi. And what we'd hope is that we have businesses and investors signing on to that. Why? It's a declaration. Fine, declarations can mean something or nothing. What I would love to keep is this global community that over the last year has been the richest of conversations, and keep working together also. I know Paul in his final comments will reference some work we're doing together on the legal sector in terms of ESG. And one of the questions there, where are the leverage points for making change and mobilizing and actually taking this conversation through the Waterberg Declaration into the UN and spreading good ideas and being fairly ruthless and direct about it. And look, as an old UN official, where I was for 12 years, running a rather, off-reservation unit, which was a partnership between the UN with banks, insurers, asset managers, and the asset owner world. The UN it's Dag Hammarskjöld and his statement that the UN was created to keep us out of hell, not lead us to heaven, which always resonates for me in terms of that, the Secretary General who's sadly killed in the Congo, I believe in the 50s in a plane crash. So let's take this conversation, shape it, mold it, do something, keep the community together, and let's do some business together. Let's get some funds flowing. Let's take the type of ideas that Carlos has or Dino has and move it to action. I'll stop there before I run out of my own time. But look, I can only thank you enough. A few thank yous very quickly to the Legal500, who've been a great partner through this. I know Guy Reeder is underpinning this platform today. So Guy, please pass on our thanks for the cooperation over the last year. Great thanks to Michael Murray, who's the Blended Capital Group partner in Cape Town. This simply would not have happened without Michael. And then our supporters have been UN in South Africa, Oriental Consultants, OC Global, who've been a generous sponsor. Future Fit Foundation found time to create a thought leadership paper. The Tony Elamula Foundation have come on twice and provided the best of executives, and your CEO will speak on Thursday, Ifeoma. Busa in South Africa, Business Unity South Africa, and also Mwezi as a small company in Kenya, has helped us along here. I'll stop there. I'm going to go to Paul Watchman for his closing comments, and then to Judge Professor King to conclude what's been, for me, a really insightful 8-month-long process. Lots of turns and tribulations and chasing people to sponsor it and create the meetings, but it's been great fun, and I feel after today it's been more than worthwhile. We have the UN, we have already nearly 600 people we'll be speaking to on Thursday, which I think is a great result, and then we're on to Abu Dhabi. So thanks to all. Paul, for yourself, a few closing comments at the end of the 8-month process, and then Judge Professor King to close. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Paul, for chairing this with such ability over such a long period of time. It seems a very long time ago we started on this. And I'd like to start with a word that I associate with you, and that is enthusiasm, and enthusiasm for ESG and the changes it can make in society. And one of the things I heard on the radio recently was Alan Jope of Unilever, the CEO of Unilever, saying that he regarded ESG as a very important magnet for talent, and that without that attention to ESG, the brand of Unilever would not be what it is. And he thinks that brand is going to be really important going forward. I did like your comment in terms of enthusiasm that Gordon was, if I got this right on the edge and right on the nail. And I just wondered how those two reconciled, but it is typical of a man who's very enthusiastic. The integration is really important. I had a lot of people talking about integration, integrated reporting, integrated solutions, integrated thinking. And I think this is really what we're starting to see in law firms too. They're organizing their practices around a number of pillars, be it business and human rights, climate change, sustainable finance. You can actually see developing not independent and silo type practices, but practices that interlock over the firms. And what we did see in our research was those firms who had international reach were actually having structures supported by their senior people to push ESG out through the law firms as they should be in other businesses. I do like the idea of corona economics, which I said this morning, and I did reference Adam Smith, who is not the most famous professor of law at Glasgow University, and that isn't me. I think the most famous person is probably Walter Kelvin, but we are the fourth oldest university, and then I have to put in brackets in the English-speaking world, because then you have to miss out all the Italians and Arabic universities that were going a very long time before any Scottish university. Another thing I picked up, particularly from Future Fit Foundation, and I think it was nice the way in which two people from the one institution complemented each other, which very rarely happens. But I do like SatNav for sustainability, as I've already said. And I did like the comment that Martin made, that from day one, you have to think about scalability, how you actually take an idea and build it up. And I actually can see that from today's conversation. There's so many people with interlocking, reinforcing ideas and ideals. Interconnectivity and synchronicity, I think, are the two words. Synchronicity came up later, but we have seen this with climate change, with the pandemic, and it was mentioned that somehow business was much more fragile than we understood and the businesses understood. But society too has proved itself resilient and fragile. There is this paradox that on the one hand, we are very, very fragile, but at the same time, we're pushing ahead with things like gender equality, sexual equality, racial equality. All these things are coming together largely because of the pandemic. And I think the other thing is realizing how interconnected the world is, that the rich cannot immunize themselves from the poor, and without equality and justice and fair treatment, there will be a price to pay. So I think we're starting to see that. And I think someone mentioned earlier about the amount of investment that's coming from private individuals in Brazil to realize that they have to provide pure water and good sanitation. I think this is Carlos, to the people who are living in much poorer conditions. So I think housing, sanitation and water, almost a Victorian conversation we're having a century later than it should be. And I'll just finish by talking about two things very briefly. One, we've noticed the repurposing of business. There has been a move away from the idea of exclusive shareholder responsibility to, if not, and I know Professor King doesn't like this description of a stakeholder capitalism, but an inclusive capitalism, and I think an integrated inclusive capitalism. And I will say just two things about that. One is that has meant that we look very closely now about the metrics in which we judge a company and we judge performance. So it's very important that we have a long-term view of things, whether it's intergenerational or longer, but not only having a long-term view, but recognizing that that long-term view must include the profitability and sustainability of companies. And that is really important. Professor King made this point this morning, that what we can't do is ignore the fact that companies have to be sustainable financially in the long term. So that's my comment. So hand it back to you, Paul.
Paul, wonderful. I can't resist it. Carlos, your figure of 10% of IUC beds being occupied in the Amazon basin because of sanitation issues, not COVID-19, and creating a problem there, was a statistic which just is both horrific and resonates. As you say, Paul, it's a Victorian conversation 100 years late. Judge Professor King, for you to close the 8-month process, and then we take it off to the merry halls of the UN, and we'll see where we end up. But thank you for both your and Paul's leadership, and it's a pleasure to as ever, have any contact with you, and it's yours to close. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Your internet looks a bit unstable.
Okay.
We've got freezing, then you come alive again.
Okay.
I hope you can all hear me clearly. I just want to close by talking about the G in ESG.
Jojo, have you done something? Have you done it with the internet?
We're still here.
I'm just asking about Stan. It's Monty Python, isn't it? Professor King, are you there? It will be the closing of a process that we won't ever forget.
He's coming back, I think.
He's coming back.
Oh, right, coming back.
Famous last words.
Would anyone like to talk about the G?
You know, what time have we got? It's just about 5 o'clock. So we'll give Professor King another minute to see if we can get him back, because it's always worthwhile listening to him. Mervyn, are you there?
While we're waiting for Mervyn, Paul, can I just mention that I read something today about the lack of awareness of ESG issues in boards and the need to train people for boards. And I think that is something that someone somewhere should be looking at as an opportunity, because I think boards are ill-equipped often to deal with ESG issues, and that there's a need for them to be properly educated, whether through consultancies but please not through their general counsel. Please not.
Paul, to be brutally and cheekily commercial, why don't you spend let's see if we can get Mervyn back, but why don't you spend two minutes on the rise of the ESG law firm and the research that we're doing together, because I see that potentially as transformational as your work around fiduciary duty. But if people can bear with us, and if we do get Mervyn back, that's great. If not, we can close. But Paul, do you want to spend do you want to do a sort of filler of a couple of minutes around the rise of the ESG law firm?
Okay. About 8 months ago, we decided that it'd be a useful thing, because I kept on seeing from law firms them putting online webinars and materials about ESG and the development of their ESG practices, etc. And I was quite intrigued by this, because having been a lawyer who did ESG many years ago, I didn't really recognize many people in that space. And some of the firms who were coming up, I definitely didn't recognize in that space. I think I annoyed some of them by describing me as retreaded tobacco litigators. And I think the issue here is that law firms have got an important point in the chain of communication between businesses and communities, and they have a position to influence their clients. So these law firms have, we looked about 40 or 50 law firms worldwide, and we looked at different sizes from boutique firms up to the large international and Magic Circle firms in the UK and the white shoe firms in the US. And what we found was quite a lot of interesting information, a little bit of, well, we could call it greenwashing or puff or however you want to, or misrepresentation. And so we looked at how they were handling ESG for their clients, what their offering was, how deep their knowledge was, what their commitment was, and how they were rolling it out across their firms. At the same time, the second thing that occurred to us was, has this actually impacted on their own culture? As you probably know, law firms get quite a bad press, particularly large law firms, in how they squeeze the lawyers for the last chargeable hour, and can be quite poor in terms of their human relations objectives. And what we've seen there, again, is much more focus on things like inclusiveness and diversity and social mobility, and race. And these things are coming through in a way in which I haven't noticed in my time in practice. Now, what I'm hoping is it's a tipping point or an inflection point, that there are real changes in law firms, as indeed there will be in other businesses. And I think it's so important, because Paul and I recognise from the outset of doing the fiduciary duties work that if we could get to the pension funds, that was a lot quicker and a lot easier than trying to get to the thousands upon thousands of companies. So we tried to influence what pension funds did by saying to them, you can have regard to these factors. And you have to remember, at the time, there was a great deal of hostility, and there is still some hostility in the United States to the whole idea that you are discharging your fiduciary duties by taking account of ESG. And I think what we're trying to do with law firms is to say, this is what we think you're doing, this is what we think you're doing well, and this is what we think you could go on to do. But equally, what we're saying is you cannot be representing certain types of clients when it's only a matter of defending the profits and also supporting certain ESG goals. And the most obvious example is supporting carbon zero at the same time as advising companies that are putting in coal-fired power stations worldwide. So those are the sorts of issues. Paul, I don't know if you've got anything you want to
No,
add
Paul,
to it?
listen, I think Mervyn will get an opportunity to make his conclusions with the UN on Thursday. That was wonderful timing. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition, but we got it in terms of the closing. Look, Dino, Martin, Gordon, Alexandra's gone, Ifioma, Carlos, Michael, Guy, Michael Murray. Great conversation. I'll pass your regards to Mervyn, Professor King. And look, to be continued. What we've already got, I mean, the figures are going up at the UN all the time. It's now way over 600. So we've got, you know, we've got input, we've got substance. We'll deliver it on Thursday and we'll take it from there. Can't thank you enough. The session is now closed, and enjoy your evening or your day or your morning. And Gordon, to get some sleep. Fantastic effort from Australia. But I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much all.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.